Imagine a parrot the size of a turkey. It cannot fly. It climbs trees like a monkey. It hoots through the night like an owl. And if you pick it up, it smells faintly of an old violin case that's been left in a damp attic for 100 years. It is, by weight, the heaviest parrot on the entire planet, and somehow almost nobody has ever heard of it. This isn't a creature from a fantasy story. It's real. It's called the Kakapo, and for most of human history, almost nobody outside one small corner of the world had ever heard of it. By the time people finally did hear about it, scientists had already given up on it. They thought it was gone. And then, in 1995, after walking through some of the most remote rainforests left on Earth, a small team of researchers sat down and did something they never wanted to do. They counted every single one left alive. The number they got was 51. To understand how a parrot ends up with a body count instead of a population, you have to go back about 10,000 years. New Zealand split off from the rest of the world so long ago that mammals never made it there. No rats, no cats, no foxes, no predators that hunted by sneaking along the ground, tracking a scent trail. For millions of years, the only real danger in that forest came from above, from birds of prey, hunting by sight in daylight. So the Kakapo adapted to a world that, as far as it knew, would never change. It gave up flying altogether because flight takes enormous energy, and there was nothing on the ground worth flying away from. Its wings shrank into stubby, half-useful things, good for balance and short gliding hops between branches, but useless for actual flight. It became nocturnal, feeding at night when the daytime hawks couldn't see it. And it developed exactly one defense against danger: freeze completely still and let the moss-green, black-mottled feathers melt into the forest floor. For thousands of years, this worked perfectly. Then humans arrived. First came the Maori around 800 years ago, who hunted the bird for food and prized its feathers so highly that a single ceremonial cloak woven for a high-status chief could use more than 11,000 individual kakapo feathers plucked one at a time. The population thinned, but it held on deep in the forests. That single cloak still exists today, fully intact, sitting in a museum collection in Scotland, carried off centuries ago by a European visitor. It remains the only complete Kakapo feather cloak left anywhere on Earth. Then, in the 1700s and 1800s, European ships arrived, and they didn't come alone. They brought rats. Then, they brought cats. Then, deliberately, in an attempt to control the rabbits and rats already destroying farmland, settlers released stoats and ferrets straight into the wild. These were the first land predators the Kakapo had ever encountered in its entire evolutionary history, and they hunted by smell, not sight. The same musty, sweet, violin case scent, drifting gently off the bird's feathers, combined with its one instinct to freeze the instant danger appeared, turned into a death sentence overnight. A Kakapo could smell like a beacon while looking completely invisible, and a stoat would walk straight to it anyway. Researchers have since confirmed this isn't an exaggeration. The scent comes from a wax-producing gland near the bird's tail, and biologists studying it have seriously proposed dabbing Kakapo nests with deodorant to mask the smell from predators, while first making absolutely sure the scent isn't something the birds themselves rely on to find each other in the dark. The collapse was almost unimaginably fast. The bird vanished from the North Island. It vanished from most of the South Island. One of the first people to really sound the alarm was a self-taught naturalist named Richard Henry, who spent 6 years personally rowing more than 700 Kakapo, cage by cage, across dangerous water to a predator-free island he believed would finally save them. He used his fox terrier, muzzled so she wouldn't hurt the birds, to sniff them out in the bush using that same telltale scent. He thought he'd found the answer. He hadn't. Around the year 1900, a stoat swam across to the island anyway. Within a few years, every bird he had saved was dead. Henry died in 1929, almost completely alone, convinced his life's work had failed. By the 1970s, most scientists assumed the Kakapo was simply extinct. Then, in 1977, a search team using trained dogs found a small surviving population on Stewart Island, off the very southern tip of New Zealand. There was hope again, until biologists noticed something troubling. Almost every bird they found was male. The handful of surviving females were being killed off by introduced cats, faster than anyone could protect them. By 1995, after combing the entire country, the final tally came in. 51 Kakapo. Left. On the entire planet, 31 males, 20 females. Every Kakapo alive today descends from that same tiny handful of survivors, and the inbreeding it caused runs so deep that even now, more than 6 in 10 eggs laid never hatch at all. The species wasn't just endangered anymore. It was standing right at the edge, and almost everyone studying it expected the story to end there. It didn't. The first move conservationists made seemed obvious enough. Round up every surviving bird, move them to small islands completely cleared of predators, feed them well, and let nature take its course. For years, nothing happened. The birds were safe, they were healthy, they had food, and they simply refused to breed. This wasn't illness, and it wasn't an accident. It was a choice, hardwired into the bird's biology over thousands of years, with a single, extremely specific trigger that almost nobody outside New Zealand has ever heard of: the rimu tree. The rimu is an ancient native conifer, and it doesn't fruit reliably every year. It masts, meaning it produces an enormous, synchronized crop of fruit only once every 2 to 5 years, in a pattern scientists still don't fully understand. In the years between, it produces almost nothing at all. Kakapo evolved alongside this single tree species for so long that their entire reproductive system became wired to it. Without a heavy rimu fruiting event, female Kakapo simply do not ovulate. Their bodies read the absence of that fruit as a signal that the forest cannot support raising a chick. So instead of breeding and risking starvation, they shut the whole system down and wait. For conservationists, this meant the real goal of the recovery program was never simply protect the bird. It was predict an entire forest. You couldn't just place 51 parrots on an island and hope. You had to learn to forecast, sometimes years ahead of time, when a notoriously unpredictable tree species scattered across several remote islands was finally going to have a good year. Because that single window was the only chance the species had to reproduce at all. What followed over the next 3 decades turned a handful of remote New Zealand islands into what might be the single most intensively monitored conservation project for any species on the planet. Every Kakapo alive today wears its own radio transmitter, fitted into a tiny backpack-style harness. Rangers don't just know roughly where each bird is, they know exactly which individual is where at almost every hour of the day and night. Some of the feeding stations built for the birds will only unlock if the correct microchip embedded in that specific bird's transmitter is detected nearby, so a smaller or less dominant bird can't get muscled out of its own food by a bigger one. It's an automated bouncer system built for a parrot. When a female lays an egg, rangers will often quietly remove it in the dead of night and carry it to an incubator, protecting it from nest predation or developmental failure. But pulling an egg away can confuse a mother's natural instincts, so engineers built a replacement. A 3D printed decoy egg that doesn't just sit there looking convincing. It actually plays back the precise sounds a real chick makes in the hours just before hatching, so the mother's body and behavior stay perfectly in sync, ready for the moment the real, now hatched chick is placed back in her nest. And when conservationists needed to artificially inseminate females using semen collected from the most genetically valuable males on the island, sometimes located across brutal terrain, they didn't send a ranger hiking for hours. They built a drone specifically for this job. The team nicknamed it, only half-jokingly, the cloacal courier. Somewhere in a hut on one of these islands, there is a literal whiteboard listing every single breeding female kakapo on the planet by name. Pearl, Marama, Hoki, and dozens more, marked week by week in simple symbols. A smiley face for a fertile egg, a flat line for one that didn't take, a tiny wing and leg icon for a chick that hatched and survived, an X for one that didn't, updated constantly by hand for a species small enough to fit on a few sheets of paper. But even with all of this, conservation kept finding new ways to surprise the people running it. When rangers began supplementing the bird's diet to help underweight females reach breeding condition, success rates did improve. But so did something nobody had planned for. Well-fed mothers began producing far more male chicks than female ones, in some seasons as much as 70% sons. For a species already desperately short on females, that looked like a win on paper and a serious new problem underneath it. Scientists had to study sex allocation theory in actual ecology journals just to redesign the feeding program around it. Part of what made this so dangerous is built directly into the bird's own anatomy. Unlike most birds, kakapo lack a diaphragm and a proper flap to seal off their windpipe, leaving their lungs unusually exposed to airborne spores. Then, in 2019, in the middle of what was shaping up to be the most successful breeding season on record, an outbreak of a fungal lung disease called aspergillosis tore through the population. It killed birds that had survived every other threat for decades. Roughly 4% of the entire species died within weeks, traced back to fungal spores in the very nest environments conservationists had built to help them breed. And yet, somehow, the population kept climbing. By August of 2019, despite the outbreak, the kakapo population crossed 200 birds for the first time since long before the species had collapsed, driven by a historic Rimu masting event and that same record-breaking season's 73 surviving chicks, the most ever recorded. In 2022, another strong breeding season pushed the total past 250. When scientists eventually sequenced the genome of every surviving kakapo, they expected to find a genetic disaster. What they found instead was almost the opposite. Birds from the surviving island population carried roughly half as many harmful mutations as their now extinct mainland relatives, as if 10,000 years of isolation had slowly filtered out the worst of their genetic baggage instead of piling it up. There is one detail in this story that almost nobody outside New Zealand knows, and it might be the most quietly remarkable part of the whole thing. In 1975, years before any of this recovery program existed, a search team in the remote mountains of Fiordland found a single, lone male kakapo, the very last of his bloodline left on the New Zealand mainland. They named him Richard Henry, after the conservationist who had died decades earlier, convinced his entire life's work to save this species had failed completely. That bird lived for decades under careful protection. In 1998, he successfully fathered 3 chicks, and because he carried the only surviving mainland genetics left anywhere in the species, his bloodline turned out to be genetically priceless, deliberately used to widen a gene pool that had narrowed almost to nothing. He died of natural causes on Christmas Eve 2010, an estimated 80 years old. A man who failed to save this bird got a second chance decades later through a bird carrying his own name and succeeded exactly where he couldn't. Every kakapo alive today still has an individual name and a tracked personality profile maintained by the New Zealand government. One of the more famous ones, a hand-raised bird named Sirocco, became internationally known after climbing onto a zoologist's head during a wildlife documentary shoot in 2009 and attempting to mate with it on camera, live, in front of a British television crew. The clip went viral worldwide. New Zealand's government later gave Sirocco an official title, National Spokesbird for Conservation, a flightless parrot representing his entire species by government appointment. As of this year, The population sits above 230 birds, climbing back from a low of 51 in a breeding season that, after a 4-year wait for the rimu trees to finally fruit again, has already produced dozens of new chicks, each one tracked, named, and logged the moment it hatched. It took one obsessed, broke, mostly self-taught man with a dog and a rowboat to first try and fail to save this species back in 1894. It took an entire country, 3 decades, a genome sequencing project, tracking drones, 3D printed eggs, and an almost unreasonable amount of money and stubbornness to actually finish the job he started. No species is too far gone, as long as somebody out there refuses to stop counting.